For people who are just joining us, Ed, breaking the news here on CBS News 24/7 that the Trump administration is logging another win when it comes to a case that had to do with the National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the Federal Election Commission. This is a ruling on campaign financing. And Ed, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court does appear to have ruled on that campaign finance restriction clause. And it is, again, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, no, this is a big one. This is something that, in essence, reinforces and may actually embolden the power of political parties. Remember, there's the Democratic National Committee, there's the Republican National Committee. And then each of those entities has other committees that are responsible for electing people to the House and to the Senate. So the Republicans call theirs the NRCC and the NRSC, the DCCC, DCCC, and the DSCC. And these two entities, especially in years where it's just midterms, are raising tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, but they can't spend it directly or in coordination with candidates. Republicans had argued that they should be allowed to do that, especially in the age of super PACs, that if you're going to have these entities set up, why not allow the political parties to coordinate directly with the candidate that they are, and to advertise with or on behalf of candidates that they are nominating and supporting? Why put up that barrier? And so the big difference to anyone watching or listening right now is only this. You will continue to see political advertising digitally and on the air. What will change is the fine print at the bottom and who exactly is paying for that advertising and how much they're paying. Because the other thing that the parties had argued is when it comes to buying advertising time, say on Channel 2 in New York or Channel 7 in Los Angeles, a candidate gets to spend less money on that 30-second ad than a political party. And what this ruling is believed to now do is, in essence, lower the price for political parties to buy that advertising in coordination with the candidate, meaning broadcasters may ultimately earn less on the 30-second spot, but they may be able to sell even more of it because the purchasing power will now be there. And all this essentially means is Republicans can coordinate more closely with their most competitive or most focused on candidates. Democrats can do the same. From a political standpoint, this immediately benefits Republicans this year because while Democratic candidates are really good at raising money themselves for their campaigns, Republican candidates haven't been as good at that in more recent history, but their political organizations, the super PACs and the parties, are very good at it. So now that money can be funneled right into candidates, and it sort of eliminates the arguments about who's doing better at raising money if, in essence, you can be taking money now from your political party and don't have to just raise it yourself. So this changes potentially the contours, especially of congressional races across the country, and certainly just reinforces the power that money continues to have over our elections, especially the handful. And really, at this point, we're dealing with fewer than 24 competitive House races across the country, where now the two parties can coordinate a lot faster and spend much more on those candidates.
All right, Ed O'Keefe reporting for us from the White House. Ed, those two decisions in this morning going in the Trump administration's favor. Obviously, we'll check in with you when we get that third and final, and perhaps the one that most people are watching right now, the one having to do with the birthright citizenship in this country. So we'll get back to you, Ed. Thank you very much. So Rebecca Roiphe is here in studio, our CBS News legal analyst. What's interesting here in this consequential case, which is probably the biggest one around campaign finance since the Citizens United one, Rebecca, is that Justice Kavanaugh is writing for the majority that the First Amendment protects political speech at its highest level. And the argument that he's making is that because money is often required to communicate political ideas, limiting money, in the majority's mind, limits free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth kind of going back and thinking about why these limits were put there in the first place. So I think the idea is that there's a concern that there would be some kind of, that this is a prophylactic. It prevents against quid pro quo corruption. So if I'm an individual donor, there are limits on how much I could give you, for instance, as a candidate. And that's to prevent me from being, look, I'm going to give you this, huge amount of money and you're going to do this for me. And what this does is kind of a roundabout preventing me from, these limits were preventing me from using the political party as a go-between. I'm going to give you this money political party, and then you can give it to the candidate, and that way I can get what I want. And so it was a prevention against that kind of corruption, and that was the justification. And here the court said, sorry, no. Like, that's too thin a reed to rest this particular kind of limit, as Vlad said, on speech. You cannot do that because we're not convinced that it's really necessary in order to obtain that goal. Like, it doesn't seem like this is such a huge problem that people are hiding, their corruption, quid pro quo corruption. And if so, we can take care of that through some kinds of transparency rather than preventing or putting actual limits on this kind of spending.
I think about the impact here, and Ed kind of got at this a little bit as we go into a midterm election. My read on this is that it essentially favors whichever party. In theory, it is equal for both parties, but it favors the party that is able to do a better job at fundraising. And
right now, that's the Republican Party. They have more money.
Right, and I worry that as we get further and further away from what policy the candidate has, that this may just come down even more so to how much money the candidate has.
Well,
that is
kind of, but that's what Justice Kagan is sort of arguing here. She's saying that that you have now coordinated spending that functions like a contribution, and that it favors billionaires and people who, you can be transparent about it. Some billionaire gave, but it still favors the person who has more money than it does the people who do not have more money, and that political parties can sort of almost become vehicles for circumventing contribution limits.
I think that's right. I mean, it is, but we already had these, PACs that were functioning in somewhat the same way. So essentially what these rules were doing were kind of disadvantaging political parties relative to PACs. And so I don't know that the difference is really, going to affect these sort of, these questions as much as it might seem at first. I think as long as there's transparency, the real justification was not, it wasn't that this is going to help small donors or this, it really was just to prevent corruption. And I think what the court is saying here, at least as far as I've read it so far, is like we just don't, we don't see this as a huge problem, that people are hiding their quid pro quo corruption through these, intermediaries of the, of the political party. They're using.
Are you saying then, Rebecca, that because that the PACs seem to have had more power than the actual parties themselves, what the court is saying is, we're giving the political parties themselves at least equal power to the political action committees.
And that in doing that, it almost brings a level of transparency through the political parties now being able to do this versus us all just being like, well, it was this super PAC that donated, like who knows where, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they're pushing the First Amendment, at least according to the court, pushes towards the solution to these problems is transparency. The solution is not limits. The solution is not shutting things down. These sorts of campaign restrictions keep failing under the First Amendment in this court. And so the court, I think, is implicitly saying the only way that you can really manage these is through transparency, to try to make things clearer so that we can see where money is going rather than preventing money going from one place to another.
Yeah, it's interesting.